Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the second of our 3 Surf Club knee boards. So today we're going to be having a look at this blue Sonic. You can see just here we've got a solar res repair over a pretty small crack in the board. So obviously we're going to be sanding this area, and in reality we're going to be sanding this area. And we're going to be removing paint as we do that, but we want to leave this S alone, so that we're not having to replace the logo down the track. So in theory, as we sand here, our first step of pre-filling our crack with resin or Q-cell is already completed because it's been solar res. So if the solar res job by the customer is good, then we can sand it smooth, get it nice and flush with the surface, and move straight on to laminating. So sadly, as is often the case, this area wasn't sanded before the solar res was applied. I noticed that the paint was removing, but the solar res wasn't feathering, and it's shiny around the edges, so they've just whacked solar res straight over the area without sanding it first, which is pretty common. I could continue to sand it off and remove it, but I would be removing paint pretty early in the process if I did that. So I would rather chip it off with a metal blade and my fingers so that I'm not removing paint too early in the process. So now the solar res is gone, I can actually start sanding it properly. So we want to make sure this whole area is dull. We want to scratch up that paint as well as we can. I'm sanding with 120 here. If you're removing paint, that's fine, it's a part of it, but we obviously want to remove as little as possible because it's just less painting we have to do down the track. Actually, while we're on the subject of removing paint, we'll watch a little bit of raw surfing in Coolangatta. I'll leave a link to this channel and video in the comments below, but it's going to be more entertaining watching this than watching me sand a board. So in the previous video, I repaired another clubby knee board. It was a green one, quite badly delaminated. Few people mentioned that all of the paint should be removed before fiberglass is applied. I certainly appreciate any feedback and all feedback, and I don't even necessarily disagree with these people. In a perfect world, you would be applying fiberglass cloth to fiberglass cloth. That's what we want to be laminating over in repairs in an ideal world. The tricky thing with boards like these, and not just clubby boards, but any epoxy board like a Torque or an NSP that's epoxy and has paint applied on top of the surface, if we were to remove all of the paint from the area we're going to repair, it makes our repair area larger than it has to be, essentially, which makes the area I'm painting larger than it has to be, and that of course is fine with me as long as the customer is willing to pay me the money to do that work. Epoxy boards in general, like these clubby boards, are more expensive just because the material or epoxy resin is more expensive, and epoxy boards that have large and intricate paint jobs above the glass are more expensive because they're harder to do, they take more time, and they require more materials in the form of paint. So as far as price goes, these clubby boards are probably my most commonly high-priced jobs. It's pretty rare I'm doing one of these jobs for less than $200, and they can move up to $250, $300. So as a repairer, I need to find the line to draw between what is a customer willing to pay me, what type of job am I satisfied to give back to them, and ultimately avoid them having to bring the board back to me in a week or two because my repairs failed. That's worst case scenario. I believe that the paint jobs on these boards are applied in a professional manner, so they're adhered properly to the surface, so I'm pretty confident in glassing directly on top of the paint as long as I've prepared the area through sanding in an appropriate manner. And I can say honestly and confidently that in almost 5 years, I've never had one of these boards ever brought back to me because a repair has failed, and the amount of clubbies bringing me boards is rapidly increasing, not decreasing. So I'm quite confident in glassing over this paint. I will add though that if the paint were chipping or fraying, I could chip it off with my fingernails, or if I'm sanding it and it's breaking away, it's not feathering in, then I definitely wouldn't glass over paint that I didn't think was properly adhered to the surface or had failed in some way because of age or whatever reason, really. So that's enough watching surfing now. Let's get on to the fun bit. Just where my finger is here, it is still shiny. So I've sanded the whole area, but next to the crack where it's dipped in just a little bit, the orbital's not able to get to it. So make sure that all of your paint is sanded. If the orbital's not getting to it, you shouldn't have any shiny areas at all. So now we're looking at this area again, and I've touched up that little zone where it was shiny, so I know that everything's scratched up. Everything's going to adhere to it. You can give it a clean off just with a towel, and we're going to pre-fill this thing with some micro balloon and epoxy mix. So on this video I wanted to squeeze in some extra tips for working with epoxy. On the next one and the last one of these 3 boards we do, I'll squeeze in some extra tips on the painting process. So if you haven't used epoxy before, I would say the key points to note are: 1, it has a very set curing time. Unlike poly, I can't make this epoxy kick faster or slower. I've got about half an hour worth of working time with it before it starts getting thick and gelling up, and then I'm done. With poly, I can make it kick in 5 minutes if I want. I can make it kick in 20 minutes if I want. I have control ultimately over the speed. Unlike poly, in which the catalyst molecules actually track down the resin molecules and they kind of bind into one another sort of on their own accord, epoxy doesn't do that. You basically have to smash the hardener together with the resin. So it needs to be mixed very thoroughly. When I'm mixing, like in a scenario like you're watching now, I count to 120 seconds and then I count to another 20 seconds. The general rule with epoxy is if you think you've mixed it enough, mix it for longer. Epoxy is very sensitive to other chemicals or elements that may be on the board, from greasy fingerprints to paint to acetones to thinners to dust. You'll end up with all kinds of weird blemishes, so your board needs to be really clean before you apply resin to it. I know I'm always harping on about foam instead of Q-cell or micro balloons, but in this case we have nowhere to insert foam. I'm pretty confident the foam beneath the fiberglass is in really good condition and it's only the fiberglass that's cracked. So I'm just trying to seal that crack up, and any low spots, I'm trying to just make them all the same height. So epoxy essentially has a 24-hour curing time. It kicks a little quicker, but we really don't want to be sanding it before the next day essentially, otherwise the heat of the friction of the orbital is going to sort of make it gummy. So this is going to be the next day. We're going to give it another quick sand to level it off. We don't want to remove the resin from where we want it, but we want to remove it from where we don't need it. So we want a nice even smooth surface. So after the surface has been cleaned, we can laminate. So I've got a 4-ounce patch here, the smaller one, and then our larger patch is a 2-ounce patch. So in total I'm putting 6 ounces of glass over this repair, but I'm just spreading it out a little. So there's only going to be 6 ounces where it's needed, and there'll only be 2 ounces where it's not needed is my goal. So same technique as always, we're going to apply a little bit of resin. You can either use your mixing stick or your squeegee for this. If you've been watching the tip of the day, you'll note the thin or the narrow squeegee. We're going to put our first patch, which is a 4-ounce, over the top, and we don't need much resin now to wet it out because we've got plenty on the surface. So we're going to wet that out, and then once that is fully transparent, we're going to put our larger patch over the top and repeat the process. And once everything is transparent, we're going to attempt to wipe all of our excess resin off. So we don't want to wipe the cloth dry, but we don't want lumpy cloth. We want it nice and flat and even. Once we've sanded that laminate and we have applied our resin coat, we can prepare that area for paint. We're going to start with 240 dry, 320 dry, 400 wet, 600 wet, and that's going to get us to this stage where essentially the repair is done, we're masked up, and we're prepped for our painting. Now with this board in particular, I had a little bit of time restraint as the owner had a competition coming up the following weekend, so we opted to go for a different coloured blue cigar band just to keep things neat and tidy but all covered, and I didn't have to spend the time on the colour matching. I could just pick a colour I already had. So in total 3 coats of blue were applied to this, fairly light coats, nothing too heavy. We will go into the painting a little more in depth in the next video. And after the colour was applied, I had 2 reasonably heavy layers of clear gloss paint, and they ran in 2 different directions. So after spraying the rails here, then I start going across the board from rail to rail, let that tack off for 10 or 15 minutes. And then my second and final clear coat runs the same direction as my paint or my colour went, so that's from nose to tail, and like I said, pretty heavy. We don't want orange peel in this paint job, we want it nice and glassy for the finished product. And because we finished our paint preparation with 600, we can now go on with 800 as a final sand. We can sand out any 600 scratches that weren't covered with paint. We can get rid of any dust or dirt, or if there is orange peel in the paint job, the 800 will take care of it, and then we can go on to polishing and we are done with another. And there she is. So that's it, until some other kid runs into it and dings it all up again. Seems to be the way with these boards. Thank you guys very much for watching these videos and leaving your comments and subscribing. It's much appreciated. I'm enjoying it, so I'll keep doing it as long as you guys are getting something out of it. And I would definitely suggest going back to the last video I posted. It was another board similar to this one, but it was quite a major repair, especially in comparison to something pretty straightforward and simple like this. So I'll leave that video link up here on the end screen. If you haven't seen it yet, go back and have a watch, and we'll catch you in the next one. Chee-hoo!